Hi, everybody. I'm Anna Hopkins with ABC 7 News, coming to you from Prince George's County for PGCMLS this week. And this week, we are filming in the Sojourner Truth Room at the Oxon Hill branch. Now, it's of course named after the anti-slavery hero and women's rights activist, Sojourner Truth. This library stands on the site of the Sojourner Truth Elementary School for African Americans. Some of the historical foundation and walls were incorporated into this structure. The Sojourner Truth Room is home to a bevy of resources on the African American incorporated towns of Prince George's County and a fine research collection on African American history. On Wednesday at 3 p.m., former students of historically Black universities and colleges, or HBCUs, share their experiences during this week's career chat. We'll learn about how their college experiences have now shaped their lives and influenced their goals for the future. Anna Malaika Tubbs, author of Three Mothers, shares insights about the mothers of James Baldwin, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Join PGCMLS Thursday at 7 p.m. for some staff's take on Black Jeopardy, and be advised and prepared for a fun laugh. This will not be your typical trivia game. Kids celebrate Black History Month at this week's Children's Readers Advisory event on Friday at 4 p.m. The highlighted titles will focus on self-confidence and feature Black and brown main characters. Look forward to a special read aloud of one of the featured books. Are you looking for something to read or watch by Black authors or about the Black experience? PGCMLS has curated an amazing list of recommendations for the Black Heritage Hub on pgcmls.info. And by the way, if you have your own favorite titles to share, at PGCMLS on social media with @PGCMLS, or join the weekly Twitter conversation on Thursdays at noon with hashtag PGCMLS Book Chat. PGCMLS doesn't just celebrate Black heritage. Discover a whole world of history and peoples on all of the library's heritage hubs at pgcmls.info and broaden your understanding of what our cultures and traditions have to offer. Thanks for watching PGCMLS this week. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you back here next week.
Good evening. I just love those infomercials by Adriana Hopkins. She does us proud. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. My name is Roberta Phillips, and I have the honor and pleasure of serving as the CEO of the library. Tonight's very special event is co-presented with our good friends at the Prince George's County Human Relations Commission, our county's civil rights enforcement and education agency. The library and HRC have partnered on some fabulous events for Black History Month, and we are super excited to host Anna Malaika Tubbs tonight, whose debut book, The Three Mothers, How the Mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Baldwin Shaped a Nation, is an essential addition to the Black History canon. Dr. Ibram X. Kendi describes the book as follows. Tubbs' connection to these women is palpable on the page, as both a mother and a scholar of the Black motherhood has had on America. Through Tubbs' writing, Berdis, Alberta, and Louise's stories sing. Theirs is a history forgotten that begs to be told, and Tubbs tells it brilliantly. Anna Malaika Tubbs is a Cambridge PhD candidate in sociology and a Bill and Melinda Gates Cambridge Scholar, graduating Phi Beta Kappa from Stanford University with the BA in anthropology. Anna received a master's from the University of Cambridge in multidisciplinary gender studies. Outside of the academy, she is an educator, a DAI consultant, and the first partner of Stockton, California. She lives with her husband, the mayor of Stockton, Michael Tubbs, and their son, Michael. Our moderator tonight is the fabulous Jamise Harper, founder of Spines and Vines. Excuse me. She's one of our hometown rock star bookstagrammers who lives in Fort Washington, Maryland. In addition to running the Amazing Spines and Vines Instagram, she also curates literary wind down events and the diverse Spines community on social media. Jamise has a distinguished career in the federal government, and on top of all that, she's partnering with Jane Mount of the Ideal Bookshelf on a new book, that highlights authors and literary figures who are Black, Indigenous, or persons of color. All of the above because, yay, intersectionality. I encourage you to borrow the Three Mothers from PGCMLS at pgcmls.info or purchase a copy from Loyalty Bookstores at loyaltybookstores.com. Also, be sure to check out the library's awesome Black Heritage Hub at pgcmls.info/heritage for resources, book recommendations, and more. Lastly, I'd like to extend thanks on behalf of our team to Helena Brantley of Red Pencil Publicity and Marketing and Christopher Smith at Flatiron Books for making tonight's event possible. Enjoy the program and welcome.
Hello. How are you, Anna?
I'm doing so well. How are you, Jamise?
I am doing well. I'm so honored to be with you tonight to talk about your amazing book, The Three Mothers.
Thank you. I love seeing it in your hands and behind you. It just looks beautiful.
It's really a great read. It's so timely. And I just want to first thank Prince George's County Library for having me moderate your event tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for accepting.
Yes. So I want to start off by just asking you, how are you doing? And were you, during this time, we're in the middle of a pandemic, were you writing during the pandemic?
I was finishing edits towards the beginning of the pandemic. Of course, it's a super long process. So I've been working on the book in some capacity for almost about 4 years now.
Okay.
And so much has changed and happened in my own life. And I became a mother to my first son and was doing my PhD, and I'm almost finished with it. I have one more step to go. I recently defended and passed. I just have a few corrections.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And now we are expecting our second baby in August.
Congratulations again.
So I'm feeling great, feeling a lot more energy now that I'm almost in the second trimester, but everything is incredible. I'm just really living my dream, and it's so wonderful to have the book out in the world. And as much as I'm missing out a little bit on doing in-person book tour events and in-person signings, it's incredible to do these virtual ones because we can include so many more people who otherwise might not have been able to participate. So I'm just counting my blessings, focusing on the positives.
I mean, your book has gotten so many rave reviews, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention the billboard in Times Square. How amazing is that?
Incredible, completely unexpected, and I'm just grateful for the extra support in not only getting the word out about the book, but through doing so that we're celebrating Alberta King and Berdis Baldwin and Louise Little for their faces to be in Times Square and have the recognition that they deserve. It just makes my heart so happy.
Yes, I want people to know that the book it talks about three mothers, and it's the mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin. And so what was your inspiration? Like, why did you want to tell this story?
Definitely a great question. I have always been inspired by mothers. My own mom is powerful, very strong. She always reminded me to pay attention to those who were being forgotten, overlooked, underappreciated. Her own work was all about advocating for women and children's rights all over the world. And in addition to that, I'm incredibly inspired by my partner's mom and his grandmother and his aunt and women who have done everything they possibly can to open opportunities for their children, even when it seemed like an impossible feat to do so. So as I was entering my PhD, I knew I wanted to join other scholars that were correcting the erasure of Black women's stories. I wanted to join Margot Lee Shetterly and Hidden Figures and be part of this conversation where we know somebody who we should have known all along, and how that changes the way we think not only about our history and American history, but where we are as a country right now. And I wanted to situate the project in what we were facing as a nation. And I think there are so many issues that Black women are facing that we need to address and we need to highlight. I focus specifically on the civil rights movement because so often it's told through the perspective of these male leaders. We often celebrate our male leaders, and this is not to erase them. It's not to say that they need to be, set aside. It's to say we're missing a big part of the puzzle when we aren't focused on our women. And then the third layer of erasure that I wanted to correct was an erasure of mothers and their experiences. The role even today is overlooked, unrecognized, taken for granted. And by doing this project, I could talk about erasure in so many different ways. I focused on these 3 women as I got more specific because they were all born within 6 years of each other. And their famous sons were all born within 5 years of each other. When I found that, I knew I'd found the 3. It was a really great opportunity to talk about American history through their eyes and speak about events that they all lived through, but we could also see how those events affected them differently and similarly based off of their backgrounds and experiences.
Well, while I was reading, I thought, and I'm sure other people probably think this, a lot about, Malcolm, MLK, and Baldwin, but for some reason, I think people probably just think that they just showed up, that they just happened, right? And so you don't really think about their mothers. You just think that, okay, here are these iconic figures in history. And I love the fact that you are bringing them to the forefront. One thing that I wanted to talk about early on, your table of contents.
Yeah.
How did you come up with the topics? Because I'm going to tell you, I thought that each one encompasses the life and the cares of Black women.
Thank you.
It just paints a great picture. So I'm going to read them off. Circumstances of our birth, the denial of our existence, our men and our marriages, the birth of our children, our trials, tribulations, and tragedies, loving our sons, losing our sons, the circumstances of our death, our lives will not be erased.
Yeah.
I mean, that just says so much. Did you plan this out? Because it definitely speaks to the lives and the concerns of Black women.
Absolutely. In a lot of ways, I had my own motivations for it, but I also am so excited about this moment now where the book is taking on meanings that I didn't even intend. I've never read the title straight through like that. And that is a beautiful summary of what I'm trying to accomplish with the book. That's pretty well done. But I would say that I was really thinking about the our part, our lives, our stories, our children. That's what I was mostly focused on. And each of the chapters are a decade of the women's lives. So I take 10 years for each of them, and that's how I progress the story. And then when I went through and thought about the themes that popped up in each of those decades, that's how I came up with the title. But in terms of reading it this way, that is so powerful. And I wish I had intended it that way. But this is such a fun part of the book taking on a life of its own now, that I get to see things that I sometimes did unintentionally, but that work so beautifully. But the hour was the part that mattered the most to me, that we would see ourselves in them as Black women, that we would know that we're still continuing their legacy forward and carrying them with them in everything that we do now.
And then I noticed that you open each chapter with a powerful quote, and that kind of sets the tone for each chapter. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Each chapter is focused on both centering the dehumanizing treatment that Black women have had to face for years and years in this country, as well as our resistance to that and the ways in which we've created life. So in celebrating literal biological motherhood, I'm actually celebrating the many ways in which we give life. And I speak about Alberta, Berdis, and Louise as these givers of life, even before they have their children. They all 3 were creative. They were artists, writers, activists. They found ways to bring new breath into the world. And I wanted to celebrate that. And so in thinking about how they each did that and how they did so through their teachings, that's what I was most focused on.
And so let's dive right in, because you said it gave you a much deeper perspective than you had before, because you were writing this book while you were pregnant with your first child. And can you delve a little bit more into that? Because you were becoming a mother and then you're writing about mothers.
It was epic. It was such a journey in terms of starting the research before I was expecting my child, and then being in the middle of it when I found out that he was on the way. We didn't know his sex at the time. We left it a surprise. And just knowing that I was creating life, but also being well aware of the dangers of Black motherhood. I've been studying Black feminism for several years now. I'm well aware of the issues we're facing, especially when it comes to the Black maternal health crisis, and how no matter how educated you might be, no matter your access to resources, no matter how famous you might be, you are more likely to die in pregnancy or childbirth in the United States if you're a Black woman. And that danger allowed me to sit in the pain and sit in the worry of how awful that is. But studying these three women also gave me hope. They never accepted these burdens as if they were inevitable. They knew that they needed to be a part of the change of the systems that viewed themselves and viewed their children as less than human. And it empowered me to feel that I could be a part of that change. And I also could advocate for myself. I knew I was going to want to have doulas in the room with me, other women of color by my side as I went into the labor room to deliver my child. And while it made me very afraid and I worried about the outcomes and I worried about my life, I was well aware of being active in the decisions that I was going to make, not only for myself, but for my child. And I've carried that forward. I mean, he's only 16 months old now, so he's still very young.
Right.
But they're lessons I hold with me in my heart because they taught me that importance of both strength as well as vulnerability, that in many ways, Black women aren't given a choice other than to keep going in this persistence. But
Yes.
it isn't only about celebrating that. It is not only about focusing on that. It's about changing our view so that we start to focus on these issues and alleviate the burden of Black women and Black mothers today.
Another thing that I really enjoyed about the book, because although you talk about the mothers, you also bring a lot of historical context as it relates to present day. And you do a lot of examining of Black womanhood and how people want to put us in a box, unflattering representations of us. And so the differences and the similarities between the mothers. And then can you talk a little bit about that?
The dehumanization at the heart of it, of this book, and the way in which we challenge that, I speak about through many different examples, but one of them is the tropes that are present that try to categorize women and Black women and put us in boxes that tell us that we are less than human, that we deserve less respect, less dignity, less worth. So those are the Jezebel, the mammy, the matriarch, the welfare queen, and even the strong Black woman trope that indicate in some way we are less than human or we don't feel the same pain as other human beings do. So I wanted to challenge that, and I wanted to break those categories apart, because even in just these three women's lives, you see such a diversity and beautiful nuance to the Black experience that so often gets forgotten. And we're reduced, constantly reduced. Our culture is reduced. Our people are reduced. We're spoken about in these generalizations that do not celebrate our wholeness and our humanity. And so with each chapter, I also wanted to break those categories down and say, look at us in our fullness. You cannot reduce us. You cannot put us in a box, and end with that feeling that we are all a part of this beautiful diaspora. And it was something that I was really proud to accomplish.
So perfect segue to introduce us to the mothers. So we're not giving anything away, no spoilers, but just introduce us to the mothers, because what I found very intriguing was that a lot of the qualities and things that they believed in that was instilled in them from their families was put forward through to their children.
Yeah.
And you see why, certain characteristics showed up in Malcolm and in Martin and in James Baldwin. So can you introduce us? Let's start with Alberta King, the mother of Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes. And it's so important to start with their background. In the first chapter, it's who they are. It's their communities who raised them. It's who their parents were. And the argument of the book is that this is generational knowledge that's getting passed down. So we connect not only to their ancestors, and then it also connects to where we are today. And I find that part to be so beautiful. So even starting with their lives, you have to start with who they were born to and what they were taught when they were children. So Alberta King was born to two parents who led Ebenezer Baptist Church. When they joined the church, there were only about 14 members, and they built it to become this beacon of hope for civil rights, even before the famous civil rights movement. But the generation before, they were leading boycotts and marches for the first public Black high school in Atlanta. They were some of the first members of the NAACP. They boycotted newspapers that disparaged Black communities. And they said, we're not going to give our money towards these organizations that disparage us. So even though they don't use the words nonviolence that MLK Jr. later will make famous, these are the tactics that they raise Alberta in. And this is how Alberta learns this is how we stand up for our rights. And she also is taught that no matter what privileges she's able to gain, because her family does have more opportunities than many other Black families of their time, that she is going to share those opportunities and she is going to use those to advance her cause and the cause of her people forward. So this is how she raises her children. And even before she has her children, another person has to be involved in that. Here comes her husband, who falls in love with her. And even in his autobiography, it's really a love letter to his wife. If you want to learn more about Alberta, even after or before reading this book, his autobiography is such a beautiful testament to how much he credits his wife with his own success. When he met her, he described himself as this green country boy. He's 6 years older than her, but he's considered illiterate. He did not have the same privileges that she did. She already has a college degree. And so all of his friends make fun of him, saying, how are you going to make the daughter of Ebenezer Baptist fall in love with you? And he approaches her and he's really shy. And, over time they fall in love, but she says to him, in order for our family to move forward, you also have to be educated. And the men in her family, the tradition is they all go to Morehouse. The women in her family all go to Spelman. And she helps him get into Morehouse, who couldn't have even gone to college without her. A man who was considered illiterate graduates from Morehouse. And a lot of this is because she herself is an educator. So she tutors him through his schooling. And when her father passes away, this is how her husband inherits the church. So I'm going to wrap this part up just because there's so much I could say about Alberta. But one of the biggest things I want people to take away from this, when we talk about MLK Jr., we often say he inherited this from his father, because Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., that makes sense. They were both reverends. And people say Ebenezer Baptist Church was Reverend Martin Luther King Sr.'s church.
It's her family.
Not true. This was Alberta's family's church. And he himself would not have become the reverend he was without his wife. He was aware of that, and their children were aware of that. So even when they got married, Martin Luther King Sr. moves in with Alberta's family. So we'll leave it there. There's a lot more I could say, but again, I don't want to give away the whole book.
But that's a good point. Like it was her family's church. It was not his church.
No.
Yes. Okay, so let's go to Louise Little, Malcolm X's mother.
She was born in Grenada, and she was raised by her grandparents and her mother. Her grandparents were liberated slaves, so they carried in their heart the importance of maintaining freedom, maintaining Black independence, celebrating that, fighting against assimilation into their white community. So although she's born outside of the United States, she experiences that extreme white supremacy and European colonization, and she sees how that has affected her people. But she's also well aware of these histories of resistance. She learns from the Carib Indians on her island that they stand no matter what, that they'd rather die than bow down to their oppressors. She learns from her West African grandparents. She learns from the women in her family how to sustain herself, how to learn. She learns to be a great writer, and she learns different trades. So she leaves Canada when she's 17. She's very young and leaves all on her own to go to Montreal, Canada, because she wants to join an international movement for Black lives. She's heard about Marcus Garvey from her uncle, and she says, that's it. This is what I want to join. This is it. This movement that says Black independence, Black is beautiful. Let's be proud of who we are. And this is where she meets her future husband, because they're both activists. So again, in history, if you're a fan of Malcolm X, you probably knew that his father was an activist. And this is why his father is murdered, because he was so proud and outspoken that people were really afraid of what he could accomplish. But we completely erase the fact that Louise was also an activist. And because they were both so important to the movement, she even wrote on behalf of Marcus Garvey. She wrote for the Negro World newspaper. She uses, again, her education, similar to Alberta, to help move a movement forward. That this was crucial in terms of Black pride.
Yes.
Not assimilating to white culture. It should sound very familiar to the man that we know.
It does. I mean, it just kind of all the dots started to connect as I was, reading the book. I was like, okay, this all makes sense. Last but not least, the one that was most profound to me, I mean, all of them were profound, but Berdis Baldwin.
Yes.
Because it took me back to a lot of his writing and explained to me, the reason why he felt so many ways about his upbringing, and his position in the world.
Yes.
And a lot of it had to do with his stepfather.
Mm-hmm.
But can you introduce us to Berdis Baldwin?
Yes, I would love to. And again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but if you're a fan of James Baldwin, you've heard about his abusive stepfather, so this is interesting. In all three cases, whether they were awesome fathers or they were not great fathers, we've heard a lot about the fathers as if it's only fathers who can influence sons. So
Yes.
No, we're correcting that history. This is not true. We'll talk about Berdis Baldwin now. She was born in Deal Island, Maryland, this tiny, tiny town. Born honestly to tragedy. Her mother passed away when she was extremely young. I actually think her mother might have died in childbirth.
Mm-hmm.
But it could have been, maybe a couple weeks after. All I know is that her death certificate is the same month and year that Berdis is born, and that she passed away from hemorrhaging. And unfortunately, that would not have been an uncommon experience. And again, like I said earlier, it's still not an uncommon experience for Black mothers. But Berdis takes from this pain, and she's wrapped in love from her older siblings and her father. And she spends a lot of her days on the water with her father, who makes money fishing and doing different things as a seaman. And she says, she carries this love and this forgiveness and the need to not hold on to pain, to not hold on to hatred, but to find a way to cope and move forward. Because when you have pain or you have hatred, it's only hurting those who you're carrying those feelings, or it's only hurting yourself. It's not hurting those who you're carrying those feelings against. And so she is also a writer. Anyone who knew her said she wrote these brilliant letters, and she used language beautifully, that even the principals at her children's schools said that she wrote letters to excuse their absences that were beautiful. I don't know how you write beautiful letters.
Excuse absence, right?
But the challenge that I'm going to take on, now that people know I'm a writer, for my own son in the future, I'm going to try to get this noteworthy. Anyways, but so she leaves Deal Island. She's searching for something more in her life. She has this artistic mind, this creative mind, and she goes to New York. This is during the middle of the Harlem Renaissance. So I like to picture her, thinking about her future, and maybe she wants to perform and be on stage someday. But she finds herself pregnant with James Baldwin, and she never really reveals the identity of the man who fathered him. She just really wraps him in her love and raises him on her own. And so they are intertwined. They are so close to each other. Baldwin, in the way he speaks about her, he dedicates so many of his works to her. He just loves his mom. And she marries David Baldwin a couple years later. And we know that from James Baldwin's writing that he was extremely abusive towards her, as well as to James and their other children. She has 8 other children with him. But she says to her kids, despite all of this pain that they have within their family, we need to focus on love. And I will do everything I possibly can to hold you in that love and give you that warmth, because there are several factors I can't control, but what I can control is how you know about your own worth through my eyes and how I see you. And how I hope you will treat each other and treat other people beyond my walls. So I'll leave it there. Again, there's a lot more I could say about Berdis.
There's so much you can say about her, because oh my God, just how she was treated and everything. And then also the father, having discovered later in life that he was really suffering from mental illness.
Yes. And so he really did not have many options for intervention. And so it's not to justify his actions in any way, but to pay attention, even from the sociological factors. What else could he do? He's suffering from mental illness. There's not therapy available to him. He is clearly affected by racism and lack of resources and lack of support that make him feel like he can't provide for his family in the way he thinks he needs to as a man. And so it really eats at him from the inside out. And even before he dies, Berdis says to James, and James really talks about hating his stepfather in his writing. And she says to him, you need to go and forgive him before he dies, because you cannot carry this hatred forward. And it's his mom, so he listens to what she tells him to do. And he goes and he forgives his stepfather and says, this was one of the most important lessons in his life. One of the reasons so many of us hold on to hatred.
Yes.
Because if we can do that, then we can avoid the pain.
Facing the pain.
The hurt. But he also says we have to face that pain. We have to move through these stages so that eventually we can find light. And he even calls himself a witness to the power of light. Again, it should sound very familiar to things that Berdis says is so important for moving yourself forward, as well as your community and maybe even your nation.
And it's just like one of his most famous quotes, really was birthed from advice from his mother.
Yeah.
About moving past, moving through hate. On page 83, you say, in times of war and economic loss, health crisis, and social upheaval, Black women are the first to lose jobs, the first to be forgotten, and the first to be unable to feed their children. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because it's a social conscious that you bring also in the book, and awareness. But right now, in the middle of the pandemic and things that are going on, you can see this happening right now. Mm-hmm. And you talk a lot about the things that these moms faced, during these times. And so can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and they were living through the Great Depression. So we also get this view of events like World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and how this impacts their lives very differently than the rest of their nation, but even how it impacts each of them differently. Yes. They had different access to resources and different access to help. In some of the ways, though, they are unified because they're Black women and their experiences resonate with one another, even though they, again, have these different accesses to privileges. So both in the similarities and in the differences, we get to better understand something like the Great Depression and how difficult it was for them to give birth to their children during this era where the entire nation was suffering, but their communities were suffering the most. And we're going to see that the most. And then when the rest of the nation is also suffering, who they decide to blame and who they decide to take their anger out on, and how violence continues to rise against Black people in the nation because everybody is worried about finances and money and so much more. Sorry, I went along with the history. What was the question?
No, you're completely fine. I was just saying that you talked a lot about the differences, the things that happens to Black women being forgotten during times of economic crisis and just being left behind and unable to feed their children.
So to relate that to today, exactly, with the pandemic, and we look at the numbers of those who had to leave the workforce, and many are saying this is women. It was women of color. We need to be very specific about that, because if we're not considering the intersectionality of the issue, then we're not going to be able to fix it. And this is a problem that our nation has faced time and time again, an inability to put our finger on the problem because we're afraid to say what's happening. Racism is playing a part. Classism is playing a part. Sexism is playing a part. And that's what intersectionality is. It isn't just talking about how cool we're all made up of different identities. No, intersectionality is entirely about addressing how the many different compounding disadvantages affect some groups more than others. Intersectionality came to be because Black women were being fired, and then in trials we're told that we can't say that you're Black, and we also can't say you're a woman, and therefore nobody is standing up for you and advocating for you. That's a really basic summary of Kimberly Crenshaw's work, but that is how we understand what's happening today. And until we're willing to say these are the particular groups that are being affected, and this is why, because of an ugly history of systems that are built on treating us as if we're less than human and have less needs than others, or we feel less pain, to go back to what I was saying about these tropes and these categories. Yes. And it's going to be very impossible to move forward.
Another thing, this book, I highly recommend that you guys please pick this up, borrow it from the library, purchase it from Loyalty Books. But Black women in the United States, it's like a celebration of motherhood and Black womanhood.
Yes.
And I would be remiss if I did not talk about, you spoke about medical torture.
Yeah.
Violence against Black women. And you say American gynecology was built on torturing Black women.
Yes.
And I just want you to talk a little bit about that, because it does play a role into the mothers, into the some of the things in their lives.
It's a harrowing fact, but one that, again, we need to address today. Crucial in our understanding of the Black maternal health crisis. and Black maternal mortality rates that we're still seeing now. And it's really just to say, in terms of focusing on systems that need change, if you never address why, how they were built, then we're not going to ever fix that. And you're going to see remnants of that for years and years and years to come. So the American gynecological system was built by experimenting on the bodies of Black women who were enslaved. Even the C-section was perfected by waiting for a woman who was enslaved to go into labor so that they could cut into her body while she was laboring. She wasn't given an anesthesia during this. Multiple different surgeries consisted of cutting into the vaginal tissues of Black women who were enslaved. If you don't address the fact that we were treated like animals, or even worse, and a system continues to be built this way, and we then think about, for instance, a famous woman like Serena Williams even going into the hospital and saying something is wrong, and doctors telling her you're fine. Because the general notion that Black women don't feel pain. And she almost loses her life, and we don't see the connection between those two things. Then again, how do we fix that? We have to be okay with these quote unquote uncomfortable conversations of saying Black women's bodies were used to build this system, and they now need to reverse that. We now need to address the biases that have been born as a result of that. And we now need to think about even something tangible, like maybe every Black woman who goes into a hospital should be given a doula for free. You know, even not somebody who's going to advocate for her.
Yes.
Understands what's supposed to happen in labor and delivery just as much as these doctors and nurses do, but who is going to stand by this person's side and say, you know, something is going wrong or not. So there are tangible ways to fix that. And even the conclusion is entirely about addressing our current issues and using Alberta, Berdis, and Louise's lives as inspiration to change, not to just celebrate the strength of Black women, not to keep congratulating us for making it through pain, or finally at least thanking us for the work
that we're doing. Yes.
Like, that's nice. But what about making our lives easier? Taking some of the burden off of our shoulders. How revolutionary could that be? How much more could we accomplish if people were listening to us instead of just clapping because of how strong we are?
Yes, that's a quote. That is definitely a quote. So I'm gonna say the mother's names, and I want you to give me one word to describe them. So let's start with Alberta.
Okay, I'll try.
Okay, take your time. So let's start with Alberta.
Faithful.
Go. Louise.
Courageous.
And Berdis.
Loving.
I was thinking loving. I was thinking loving in my head. That's okay, good. If you could ask each mother a question, what would you ask them?
I've thought a lot about this because, you know, a lot of the projects that I was sort of trying to join with my work and my inspirations, like Isabel Wilkerson and the Warmth of Other Suns, and like I said, Martin.
That's one of my questions.
Okay. But in their work, they were able to interview the people that they were talking about, and I didn't have the opportunity to do that. You know, I wish because I was 7 when Berdis passed away, with Alberta and with Louise. Louise passed away 1 year before I was born, and Alberta was assassinated 20 years before, tragically. And again, nobody ever talks about how she lost her life. But I wish that someone had interviewed them so that we could have heard more from their experiences. You know, even the way we hear about it from their loved ones and their family members, you can tell that it's skewed and not entirely what I think they would have said. You know, it's like beautiful celebrations of them. But for instance, when Alberta loses MLK Jr. and then her other son just 15 months later dies unexpectedly and still without answers to what happened exactly, her husband simply says how strong she was and how she just persisted and was there for everybody else. But if I could have asked her directly how she felt in that moment. Of course, the words were probably not enough to describe that, but just to understand and see her more in that full light. Because I am also a Black woman, I think I maybe would have understood that better than what her husband was able to see and what he was assuming about her experience.
Yes.
When I think about Louise Little, and maybe for her, after her 25 years of being put away in an institution against her will, simply because a white male doctor said that she was, quote unquote, imagining being discriminated against, and therefore diagnosed her with dementia praecox instead of depression, which is probably more likely what she was experiencing. But again, puts her away for 25 years of her life. And then she comes out of that institution and still lives for another 25 years. My question would be how? How did you do this, and how did you make it through 25 years of what she saw as imprisonment? And with Berdis, you know, I really would have just asked to see some of her letters. All of her grandkids who I was able to speak to, and children, even in our brief conversations with some of them, they talked about these letters that she would send them on their birthdays. I guess she never forgot a birthday, even though she didn't really keep a calendar. She sent everybody letters filled with these lessons around loving each other, but again, with beautiful language and ways of seeing it that just kind of switched the way you were looking at whatever situation. I would have just wanted to sit with some of those letters and gain some of that wisdom directly from her own words.
I think for me, as I was reading, I thought, you know, they birthed these revolutionary, iconic men. And for me, I would want to ask them, you know, how did you move through your fear as a mom of a Black son? You know, how did you move and navigate for the fear of having your Black son in this world?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
and I think something that I found really cool in their lives was that they also admit vulnerability. You know, I think it feels tempting to, again, celebrate them for their strength or say that they were the strong Black woman and they persisted and made it through everything. But throughout the book, there's examples of them being very honest about being sad or feeling worried, or, you know, even in Alberta's case, she believes in God's plan for her and for her family, but she also admits that she's worried. And she's constantly concerned, even to the point where the doctor says you need to like take to bed because you are freaking yourself out so much. But that to me is this honest vulnerability of her humanity. She's not going to sit around and say, my child, my children, all three of them, in the different ways that they're participating in this movement that, again, I also participated in because my parents taught me how. I can't just sit here and say that that doesn't scare me.
Yes.
They're risking their lives day in and day out. And I think it also allows us to see the three men who we so revere as the human beings who they were. You now get to see them as the young baby boys that their mothers are just holding and loving and putting on their laps and, you know, telling them cute little stories about the world, and sometimes some very hard and scary ones, the truth that they need to tell them in order for them to live in this country. And then you see the pain that their families experience when they die. And even before that, how afraid they are for them and how it hurts to be away from them. That appreciation of these men also returns humanity to them as well.
So I wanted to ask you too, because you brought it up, but what about your research for the book? How much research? How was your research? Was it really difficult, or, you know, did you discover something that you didn't know, some fun facts? I mean, talk about your research a little bit.
It was very difficult. I guess if you told me how much I was going to have to do in order to finish the project, I still would do it. But whoa, let me take some time, or maybe not like have so much else on my plate. But it was really such a beautiful journey, and I loved every minute of it, but it also frustrated me. Every single fact that I found was like a needle in the haystack. And sometimes when I would find it, I was excited, but then I also realized, okay, this is being told through a male gaze, and now I need to do further research to better understand what's happening here. You know, because with Louise Little, for example, her story has been reduced into people just saying that she, quote unquote, went crazy. That's just heartbreaking. And so when I see that, I'm like, something's up. There's something that I'm missing, and had to go and look for other archives, and was really lucky that several scholars were able to help me with that. Very specifically with this one, Garrett Felber, who I don't think he's watching, but if he is, thank you, was willing to share his folders with me. He works directly with Manning Maribel, and he had these letters between, Louise or the hospital and what they'd said about her. He's the one who had this letter that the white male doctor wrote to the state where he diagnoses Louise. He had letters with Malcolm writing to his brothers about how much his mom had influenced his journey. And this hadn't been published before. And there's a lot of different problematic things that Malcolm X said about women as well. So that is also a part of his identity. But we've never read that he said, my mom is the one who introduced me to this first, that he actually saw joining the Nation of Islam as a return home to her. Thank her for that. And even this dictionary, story where if you're a fan of Malcolm X, that he sat in prison and wrote every word in the dictionary to return to knowing how to read and write and speak in ways that he did before his mother was taken away from him, and he becomes Detroit Red for that period of time. But he does this because his brother says, remember what mom taught us. And she sat with them when they came home from school, and she put these newspapers out from around the world, and they had to read them out loud. And if they didn't know a word, she had a dictionary right beside them that they had to go and look up the word and write it out. So these are the facts that they kind of just snowballed. I'd find one thing and then go to the other. I started with research on the sons because of the books that were already available, and took the women from the margins and put them in the center. I then had this sort of master list of events, some contradicting each other, so I had to clarify some of those. I reached out to scholars who knew the men well and could give me access to letters and books. And sometimes I sat there for hours and didn't find anything, but I also could find traces of them. As I started to understand the women's personalities, I could see them and find them even when their names weren't being mentioned. I now could go back to things that the men had read or written and said, that is Berdis is right there. That's Berdis. That's so exciting, So it was difficult, but I'm also really grateful to local historians in the different places where the women lived who helped me find birth certificates and death certificates and so much more. But all of these different things are what created the book. And I'll finally say about this, that there's a lot more out there to be said about the women. Each of the men have several books that are written about them. And each year we get new books about each of the men. So it's the same for these women. Each of them could have had their own book. And I hope that in presenting this, there will be more. There's actually a book by a woman named Jessica Russell, who is from the UK. And she's written a much longer account of Louise Little's life. So I'm excited to see more of that. I just want to see more.
I can't thank you enough. Just the research and the information is just really, it's so timely and it's so needed. But I have to ask you, because I heard that one of your inspirations, one of your authors that you like, that you love, is one of my favorites, Isabel Wilkerson.
Absolutely.
Yeah, she's an inspiration for you. Yes. And just talk a little, we're going to jump into some questions, but just talk a little bit about her, because I tell you, The Warmth of Other Suns is probably my favorite book and the book I recommend the most to everyone.
It's powerful in terms of how she weaves these stories together. And just really, when you read that, you cannot understand our country nor this world without understanding Black people's experiences.
Yes, absolutely.
Tells you about the history of each place. I was incredibly inspired by her. And the fact that people have said, this is sort of a new Warmth of Other Suns, I fall over anytime someone my name in a sentence with hers. If I even get to meet her someday, I am just going to freak out. I am so inspired by her. And I haven't had the opportunity to read Cast yet, but I already know it is groundbreaking and going to change my life in a whole other way. I don't even know what else I could say about her. I'm such a fan.
And you talked about the Great Migration in the book. And so that kind of made those memories come back to me, the way you described everything in the book. So just phenomenal.
Thank you.
So I think we have a couple of questions.
Oh, fun.
Oh, Nick, you know I can't see that.
I can see it. Do you want me to read it?
Yes, I can. Oh, okay. Which mother do you believe had the most difficulty?
Mm.
And it says in the new book on Malcolm X that author writes of this.
I try not to put pain in a kind of hierarchy because it's so unique to each person's situation. On paper, of course, you could speak about the fact that Louise Little, her husband is murdered. She is put in an institution against her will for 25 years of her life. The year she's released, it's only a couple months later that her son is assassinated.
Yeah.
That is tragic. But then you think about Berdis Baldwin, who is born and her mother dies, and she is then in a relationship where she faces abuse day in and day out. She lives to see the death of 2 of her children. That's incredibly painful. You can't even put, again, some kind of ranking on that. And Alberta King, who lives quite a privileged life, she loses both of her parents before she's 40 years old. She is assassinated herself. And before that, again, 2 of her sons are maybe killed. We know that one is for sure. And the second, it's possible. He was found drowning in his pool, even though he was a great swimmer. So he was also a part of the civil rights movement, very active right alongside Martin. So many believe that something had to do with something with his death. So I can't say who had the most difficulty. I don't think there's a way to rank that. I can just say that they all understood difficulty.
Absolutely. I think we have another one. It says, can you talk about how Alberta lost her life?
Yes. It's tragic and heartbreaking. And I'll first say, before I get into the circumstances of the day that she died, or the day that she was killed, that all of her life she spent worried about other people, and she constantly expressed her concern, and she wanted to protect them. She said this about her husband. She was like, don't travel so much. And she said this to her children, I'm worried about you, so much so that they all had to call home all the time to just let her know that that day they were doing fine and they were doing okay. Even the day that MLK Jr. was assassinated, he'd spoken to his mom on the phone that morning to let her know he was okay. But nobody really showed concern for Alberta. There was no one who said, Mom, I want to protect you, or we're worried about you, or your safety as a Black woman in America. And I think that this contributes to the fact that no one is watching her back when she's playing the organ at Ebenezer Baptist. She had founded the choir there. She played instruments there. She taught people, several different forms of music. And this was one of her biggest impacts on the world, was her passing on her musical talents to other people. But she's playing the organ, and a man who was, I think it was something like, maybe a couple weeks he had been released from an institution. He was facing mental illness himself. And he'd gone to the church because he wanted to actually kill her husband. This was his goal. But he said that Alberta was closer to him at the time in terms of proximity. And he decided to shoot her instead. And he just stood up right before, in the middle of a service, and said, I'm taking over here this morning. And everyone kind of turned to him in this fear and worry. And then all of a sudden they heard Alberta kind of screech in agony, and there was blood. And then he hurts and injures, I think, a couple other people. But Alberta, they take her to the hospital where she dies from her wounds.
Very sad.
It's awful.
Very sad. Very sad. So what are you working on? What's next?
Gosh, it's so crazy. I feel like I've really arrived as a writer when people are like, what's next? It's so cool. And it's cool that people want there to be a next project. And I'm grateful for that question. I am first going to, there's another audience question. I just saw that.
Where is it? Where is it? Yeah, let's do that. Of all the Black mothers, what made you select these 3 mothers? Yes, great question.
There's so many other stories I want to tell. There's so many out there. I just had to narrow it down eventually, and decided that, with the civil rights movement, it's so male oriented. We talk about the fact that women are erased in so many different ways. You know, they're contemporaries. Quite often we talk about that, and we talk about the fact that we started to talk about the fact that their partners have been erased, etc., which I completely agree. There's so much more to be said. And even their sisters, I want somebody to write a book about their sisters of all.
Yes.
They're incredibly inspiring. And again, just carry this notion forward that the men were, you know, a part of something so much larger. But I just had to narrow it down. A fourth mom that I was thinking of including was Medgar Evers' mother, because of this contemporary between the four of them in conversation. But I watched I Am Not Your Negro close to when I was starting this project, and I became really just inspired by James Baldwin and the way he talks about his friends, Martin, Malcolm, and Medgar. And so that's how I got to those four at the beginning. And then I just decided with the timeline, it made the most sense. And the three men had the most written about them. So I was also well aware that I had some limitations. This project was already going to be difficult. I was trying to recreate a historic record that was not in existence, and I needed to put these puzzle pieces together. And it seemed most manageable to start with men who had the most written about them, because I would have at least a lot of archives to dig into. And of the four, these three were the most famous and had the most written. I think there's a lot more left to be said about Medgar Evers and his identity. And again, I could have spoken about his mother, but there wasn't as much written about him to begin with. So that's why I narrowed it down to these three. But there's so much more that we should celebrate. And I actually hope this book forces people to write about their moms. I've been seeing these posts on Instagram where, oh, it's paused. Is it on my end? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm sure if it's our computer issue, but we can keep going.
It's a good pause, though. It's a good screenshot.
Yes, it's very glam. Well, we'll make do.
Yeah, no worries. I was just saying that I've seen these wonderful posts on Instagram where people are putting, you know, their moms in these gold frames and taking pictures of them, like the cover of the book. And I want to see more of that, more celebration of Black mothers. So let's keep that tradition going and tell their stories. I would absolutely love that. I see another question.
Yeah, so Ronnie asks, could you address the story about Malcolm X having had a meeting with Klansmen?
Honestly, I'm not an expert in the men. I really am more of an expert in the mothers. So I don't know enough about this circumstance too. She's back.
Yay. No, you're good. I'll hop off.
This was the most.
Computer decides to shut down and
no.
and I was trying to hold it off the whole time. I'm so sorry.
You're
so go ahead
perfect.
and finish your answer. I'm so sorry.
No, you're perfect. You know, usually my Wi-Fi is really bad. And so when someone else pauses, I think it's me. So I was just like, maybe they can't hear me talking.
I'm so sorry. I was trying to hold
You're
it
wonderful.
off, shutting down, and it shut down right at the end. So
No, you're totally fine. Yeah, and I finished the question, but I was just telling them that I was seeing more people post about their moms in these gold frames and telling us more Black mothers stories. And
yes.
I just want to see that more, that everybody deserves their royal gold frame. But then we had another question about Malcolm X in a meeting that he had with Klansmen. And I said that, you know, as much as a lot of people do want to hear more about the sons, and I have to remind everyone, I'm not an expert in the sons. I understand these mothers better than any others, but I don't know. I don't know about this meeting that he had with Klansmen. So I'm sorry. I can't help with that question.
Well, this has been very inspiring. And I have to tell you, I also enjoyed the audiobook, which I downloaded from
the library.
Yes. I did. And you narrated yourself. How was that narrated?
I was so, I was nervous. It's so funny though, when I said I wanted to narrate it, because this book is very personal to me as well. So I thought it made sense for me to narrate it. But my audio producer was like, well, you're going to have to audition. And I was like, it's my book. Why have to audition? But it made a lot of sense to, it's very difficult. And these professional voice actors, kudos to them. It's incredible what they pull off and how they bring these words to life. And so I gained a very deep appreciation for them. But I also was very happy that I was at least good enough to read my own book and that I was chosen to do it. And I'm proud of that, but it's, it's unique. I have a unique voice. I have like a higher voice than most people be having. So I was like, let's see how it goes, but I'm glad that you enjoyed it.
I'm an audiobook listener. So I read the book, but then I went back. As soon as it dropped, I started listening to the audio.
I love that.
Nice job.
I love it. Thank you so much.
So it has been my pleasure to talk to you about The Three Mothers. What a fantastic book. I wish you all success. I love seeing all the rave reviews in regards to the book, and good luck on the rest of your virtual tours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Oh, we can't hear you, Renee. I think you're muted.
There we go. All right. I didn't drop my computer though, so it's all good. So thank you so much, Anna Malaika and Jamise. This was incredible, incredible. For those who are listening, go get the book. Go get the book. So thank you for spending this time with us tonight. We thank everyone who tuned in to listen and to engage with one another and with us with the questions. Yeah, there are not enough words. So on behalf of the Human Relations Commission, I want to thank also the Prince George's County Memorial Library System for their ongoing partnership, bringing this and other amazing programming to you, some of which I want to just draw your attention to right now. Next week, Tuesday, our Elephant We Don't See Diversity Dialogue will start again, when Kyla Hannington, who's from the Human Relations Commission, and Michelle Hamill from the library discuss Tanisha Coates' Between the World and Me. And this starts on March 1st. So please, please join us then. We also welcome writer Juan James in conversation about her essay collection, Table Scraps, and that's on March 8th. And we're thrilled to talk to Michael Twitty. He's the author of The Cookie Gene, about his new cookbook, Rice. Now, we have lots of other good stuff coming up, and we invite you to check this out on pgcmls.info/events to see what else is coming your way. If you haven't had the chance to read The Three Mothers yet, please take this out at the library or buy the book at our library partners bookstore, Loyalty Book. It's in Maryland, Loyalty Books, plural, sorry, in Maryland and in DC, and they'll ship it to you wherever you are. So thank you again. Thank you for this great discussion, and thank you again, everyone else, for tuning in tonight. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Bye-bye.